Hi, I'm Bob Fisher, and I'm your host today on This Is Design Intelligence. Eric Cesal is a designer, educator, writer, and noted post-disaster expert. He has been called architecture's first responder by the Daily Beast for his work leading Architecture for Humanity's post-disaster programs from 2010 to 2014. On this edition of This Is Design Intelligence, he talks about the red thread running through his multifaceted career, the event that caused him to realize the true power of design, and how, with good design strategies, architects can design the disaster out of extreme natural phenomena.
Welcome to this edition of This Is Design Intelligence. Conversations with leadership voices in the built environment.
Eric Cesal, welcome to This Is Design Intelligence. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Well, Eric, you've had a very multifaceted career. It's taken a lot of different directions, including the value of architecture and design, disaster reconstruction, sustainable design. Now you've been writing and thinking a whole lot about AI and its impact on the professions, and you've had a lot of roles. You've been an author, an educator, a post-disaster expert, and one has to wonder, what is the kind of red thread that goes throughout such a multifaceted career? What are the things that unify all of those pursuits and roles?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's one I receive frequently. I would say that there's a couple of threads through all of that. One is a kind of humanitarian instinct. I mean, it's always been something that's very close to my value system and the value systems of my family. And, I was a humanitarian a long time before I ever became an architect or thought about it. I've been a humanitarian since I was 6, and my father used to drag my sister and I down to the soup kitchen to serve food to the homeless. He grew up on a farm during the Depression, and I think always had the sense that whatever we had was a blessing and a fortune, and those with fortune needed to pay it back. So that's always been central to what I do. The second would probably be a preoccupation with the value of design. I think I'm a child of the recession. I graduated grad school in December 2008, so right into the heart of the Great Recession. And I think for all the architects of my generation, we have this haunting question of what is this all worth? All these, amazing skills we have in design. What's it good for? What's it valuable for? And, looking at the economics around architecture, one could be forgiven for suspecting that that's not worth very much. So I don't believe that. So a lot of my work is about proving the otherwise, proving the value of design. And I'd say the final one is probably some kind of instinct towards calamity. I don't know how to explain that one, but I think my mind has always had an easy time going to the worst case scenario. And I think that it's not to be morbid, it's to understand, what that is so that we can then begin to design against it. I think between the three of those, they really start to explain what would otherwise seem like disparate areas of focus throughout my career.
So take us all the way back to when you decided that you were going to become an architect. What was that moment, or what was that process like?
I mean, I think the real beginnings is probably the first architecture class I ever took. It was with Dietrich Neumann at Brown University, and it was an intro survey course into architecture. And Professor Neumann was a fantastic lecturer and would tell these soaring lectures about, modernism and this audacious idea that we were going to use architecture to heal the world and make justice and eliminate poverty and all those things. And of course, we know modernism didn't exactly work out that way. But I think for a young person who was looking to find a way to fix the world, it was very, very attractive. And I don't think I've ever lost that sensibility, by the way. I mean, I still believe that architecture is probably one of the best vehicles that we have for righting social wrongs and bringing the earth into justice.
So really it tapped into that first of the three reasons, right? The humanitarian instinct that you had, or the humanitarian bent that you have.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think that's what appealed to me about it. The idea that the way that we design buildings, the agendas that we have inside our minds and inside our pans could be that instrument of social change the world.
So from the time that you first heard those lectures and you thought, okay, well, architecture could be a vehicle for some of the humanitarian work that I want to do. From that moment until the end of your architecture training, how did those ideas evolve? Did they deepen?
Quite a bit.
Did they splinter? Did they go a different direction?
It's more like a roller coaster, I think. So I finished undergrad and I went into commercial practice and worked at a couple of firms in DC. And I had an experience that is probably common to a lot of young architects, which is, picking up on the lack of agency that architects have in the built environment. In school, you're taught that it's really the architect that is the agent, the sort of progenitor of the built environment. And then you go to work and you realize, like, wow, there's a lot of other people in this room, and most of them have much more say than the architect does in terms of what transpires. And that fueled my interest in graduate school after a while, and I went to Washington University in St. Louis originally to do a double master's. I was going to do a master's in architecture and an MBA, and it ended up being triple master's. I added a master's in construction management, but all of that was serving the same purpose. I mean, the idea was to cultivate skills at the front part of architecture and the back part, MBA being the finance part that controls all the decisions that come before the architect's role, and construction management, all the decisions come after an architect's role, and, construct those into some sort of skill set by which one can have more agency over what actually happens in the built environment. I was still trying to fulfill that dream that I had in Professor Neumann's class. And my studies were not interrupted, but punctuated maybe by Hurricane Katrina, which occurred in my second year of graduate school. So I went down there on a volunteer basis, and I started volunteering with the Gulf Coast Community Design Studio under David Perks. And I would say that helped me realize much more so than did either my years in practice or my years in graduate school what the real power of design was. I think when you see the built environment completely stripped away, you see everything has been lost, then you really start to confront what the built environment means and what's embedded in all of those design decisions that we make that feel like the click of a mouse or the stroke of a pen. I mean, it's people's livelihoods, it's culture, it's history, it's people's memory, it's people's psychological well-being. Everything that we are as a people and as a species is wrapped up in the built environment. And when a disaster comes, it takes the buildings away, it takes all that stuff too. So the process of disaster reconstruction is really about, it's about bricks and mortar, but it's also about reconstructing all of those things as best you can, or putting yourself in service of the people who are trying to rebuild those things for themselves. So my faith in architecture, I would say, combined with my work in graduate school and my volunteering on the Katrina recovery, by the time I graduated, my faith in design was at an apex. It was at an all-time high. The day after graduation, it was a little bit different. But yeah, going up to 2008, my faith in design really started to decline quite a bit.
So was it your trip down to New Orleans to help with rebuilding efforts after Katrina? Was that really when you felt like your path in life was cemented?
Well, the first trip was actually to Biloxi. The subsequent summer, I went to New Orleans. But no, I don't feel it was cemented. I hope it's not cemented now. I remain open to the idea that there's more to be learned and more ways to grow. And as eclectic as my career may have seemed so far, I hope it continues to be punctuated by interesting, quote unquote, detours into different areas of practice. And I find that when you act out of values and you're pursuing the fulfillment of a value system as opposed to the requirements of a particular profession, you'll find your way into different things. And to me, that's been a joy. To your point, though, I mean, yes, after my experiences there, I think it became very hard to look at anything in the way of conventional practice, being so intimately acquainted with disaster in Biloxi and New Orleans, and cognizant of the fact that climate change was going to bring those kinds of disasters home for many, many, many more people over the subsequent decades.
So tell us about, because there are not that many people out there who have the same kind of expertise that you do relative to disasters and how one rebuilds from them. Tell us a little bit about at a high level, how architecture and design professions and the construction professions can best help both before and after natural disasters.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a saying in my business, there's no such thing as a natural disaster. And that's what I try and teach in my classes. The disasters are effectively designed. And that's a weird way to put it. And if you'd like an elaboration, please come take one of my classes. Disasters happen after typically decades of policy and neglect. And there's nothing inherently disastrous about an earthquake or a hurricane. Those events have to be brought into proximity with a vulnerability in the built environment in order to constitute a disaster. So architects, contractors, engineers, because, that's our space, we have an opportunity to essentially shepherd and direct which disasters happen and which don't. To be very clear, we can't direct, which hurricanes happen, which earthquakes don't. But those aren't disasters. They're just natural events. I mean, Japan has 5 earthquakes a day and, and very rarely creates any kind of disaster because their entire built environment is built around the idea that they're going to be having earthquakes. I think, there's the obvious role of designing for disaster and, adhering to building codes and everything like that. But I think architects and engineers have a higher responsibility towards advocacy. Building codes are necessarily slow and our climate is changing much more rapidly than we'd like. And I think there's a role in the next couple of decades for architects to step up and say, look, we need to change this. We need a built environment that reflects what our climate is going to be like 30 years from now, not 30 years ago.
One thing that intrigued me in what you were just saying is talking about an extreme weather event, what we might call a natural disaster. It's actually just an extreme set of conditions, right? So what you had been saying is, as long as we design for those types of extreme conditions, then an extreme weather event doesn't have to become a natural disaster. Is that pretty fair understanding?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's lots of extreme events and natural occurrences that were disasters once upon a time, and we basically designed the disaster out of them. Fire being the obvious one, right? Once upon a time, if you had a fire in any part of your city, you had a fire in every part of your city pretty quickly, and it would metastasize into a full-fledged disaster. And with the application of building codes and different material choices and good design strategies, that's no longer the case. So we're never going to eliminate earthquakes and hurricanes and tornadoes. I mean, these are natural phenomena, but I think we can design the disaster out of them to a large degree with different design strategies and perhaps architects taking a different role, a larger role in society than they currently do.
Well, I'm thinking about the incident at the Fukushima nuclear plant. And one might think, we need to prepare for a seismic event, but I'm not certain that the designers there prepared for what might happen when there was a flood. How is it that as a design community, we can become better at anticipating some of these things that are counterintuitive or maybe haven't happened before? It's easy to learn lessons from history, but how do we learn lessons that haven't happened yet?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is that no one can predict everything, right? And to some degree, trying to predict these big one-off events is a waste of energy. I mean, there's a cost-benefit analysis to any kind of design strategy. And you're exactly right. In the case of Fukushima, I mean, Japan is very, very serious about its seismic design, but it did not anticipate a tsunami penetrating the reactor core and all of this stuff. The critical thing, I think, is how we socially react to disaster, right? So when something happens and lives are lost, property is lost, do we take the opportunity to say, let's do things differently? That has been largely the case throughout all of human history. And that's why, our civilization is so robust and our cities are so amazing, is because something happens and we all kind of collectively sit around and we say, well, we don't want that to happen again. So, let's change things. And we've been doing that less, I think, in the neoliberal era. We've become a lot less proactive in terms of changing our modus operandi after a disaster, right? And when Katrina happened, I thought we were going to redesign every American city. I mean, at least the ones in the water. And we were going to say, okay, well, we don't want that to happen anywhere else. So, let's change this, let's change that, and this sort of thing. And of course, that didn't happen. There's still a lot of vulnerabilities in coastal U.S. cities, including New Orleans. So I think that we need to kind of step back into that role. And that's a special window of time, which architects can be especially useful in the aftermath of a disaster, saying, look, diagnostically, what caused that? What are the design strategies that led up to that event becoming a disaster? And how can we learn from that? And how can we reinvent the way we do things? After 9/11, we redesigned every airport and every public plaza. And, since then, we haven't had another 9/11, knock on wood. So, we can do the same thing with earthquakes and hurricanes. I think it's a question of social and political will. And I'd love to see architects be leaders in that effort.
Yeah, well, you've worked in a lot of parts of the world where economics are also a big challenge in both being prepared for extreme weather events and other kinds of natural events, as well as recovering from them. How do strategies adapt to areas that may not have the financial resources of a country like the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to make a distinction. I mean, not to be catty, but there's a difference between there not being financial resources and financial resources not being distributed properly. So I think in a lot of the places in the global south that we would point to and say, oh, they're very vulnerable and they don't have the resources to do the sort of preparation they need. It's not entirely true. The resources are there. They're not in the hands that would deploy them for that purpose. So I think that's one question that we have to get over. To the abstract question of whether resilience, and that's what we're talking about is resilience, requires money, I would say that it doesn't. When I was in the Philippines after Typhoon Yolanda, one community took me to a cave, and that was their typhoon cave, and for probably thousands of years, whenever a typhoon was arriving, the whole village just kind of went to the cave and hid out in the cave, and that way they knew they were going to be safe until the typhoon passed and they could rebuild afterwards. And everybody in the community knew where the cave was, and that was the place to go. After wealth and income, social cohesion is the best predictor of resilience in the event of a disaster. So that's something that doesn't take money. That just involves being a member of your community and working with others. And if you as an architect are part of that community benefits from all of the ideas and expertise that you bring. So in resource constrained environments, I think there's still a lot to do in terms of fostering resilience that doesn't require multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects. Sometimes it just requires common sense and caring about one another.
Where are situations where you've seen it done right, and where are situations where you've seen it not done right?
Where it's been done right. Well, I mean, there's lots of examples. One of my favorite stories to tell is about Galveston and the storm there in 1900. They had a very powerful hurricane. And after the fact, they kind of bury the dead and then they looked around and say, okay, well, what caused this? And the people that are making all the decisions about infrastructure, mostly about dredging the canals and the waterworks and things like that, was called the Deep Water Committee. Essentially like a town council or something like that. So they're in a lot of trouble because this had happened. And it was exposed that it was highly corrupt. It was all the landlords of the town. And, a lot of their staff didn't know what they were doing. And they went to the state and appealed to have their town charter redone. And, got themselves a new town council. I think it was 5 people and 2 or 3 engineers. So, they built a town council not out of wealth and privilege, but out of expertise. And, they elevated the entire city of Galveston, or most of it, sometimes up to 16 feet, and built a new seawall. And Galveston's taken some hits since then, but it's still around. So it went from, being potentially washed out into the ocean to a city that still exists today. And the benefit, well, there are lots of benefits, but one of the unintended ones was that the toilets finally worked. Galveston was incredibly low-lying, so like the toilets didn't particularly work, or they would get stopped up easily. But once they raised the city 16 feet, they had that quarter inch per foot that, you could use the bathroom and it would flow out into the ocean. Not that we would dump human waste in the ocean today, but that's the way they did it back then. So, that's a kind of archetypal good recovery, because it rebuilds not just the stuff that fell down, but the things that were causing the vulnerability in the first place. And it takes an opportunity to make life better through that process of recovery. So what you're rebuilding is not what you had, but something better than what you had. And that was a horrible storm. 1 in 8 Galveston residents was killed in that storm. I mean, it was just absolutely horrific. But they did it right, and they took the opportunity to actually correct for the systems that have been causing the vulnerability in the first place. In terms of where it's been done wrong, these days that's a much longer list. I think that we are really, the neoliberal era has forced some ideas onto disaster recovery, which are pretty tragic in the sense that we focus on restoring what is, or sometimes not even doing that. The Biden administration has released several programs that are starting to push money at the idea of improving resilience and rehabilitating things after the fact. That's a really good step in the right direction. But historically, in the United States, insurance companies would pay out to restore whatever your property was. And if you can imagine, like you live in a flood zone, your house floods, they cut you a check for whatever your house was. And I encountered this in the rebuilding after Hurricane Sandy with a lot of people who would say, look, I've got a check to fix my house to the condition that it was in. But what about the next storm? Like, wouldn't it make sense to elevate their house? Well, who cares? There's no money to do that. And, somebody has just been through a disaster. They've probably been out of work. Money is incredibly tight. And who is going to fork over 50 or 100 grand to elevate their house or make all these sorts of improvements? I think that the psychosocial dimensions of recovery are another area where architects can really participate. They can point the finger and say, look, this doesn't make any sense to spend all of this money to restore people to a condition of vulnerability that existed the day before the storm or the earthquake. We have to put people back into better conditions that are going to resist a repeat event.
So we've talked about a lot of different ideas for roles that architects can play or actions that they can take to make a positive difference in building a more resilient built environment. How do all those ideas translate to, kind of your second part of your red thread, which is the value of design? Tell us about your evolution of thought there. And when you're talking to like a layperson who is not from the world of design, how do you explain to them the value it can bring?
There's always an eye-opening moment, I think, in every class that I've ever taught. And when I've been taught this, my eyes open too, that everything in the world is designed. Steve Jobs, I think, had a viral speech about this at the Stanford graduation, that you become quite liberated when you realize that everything in the world was designed by someone who probably wasn't any smarter than you. The world takes on a physical shape because of people's choices and, how we direct our energy in the process of that design. I think the value proposition of architecture has always been there, right? That it is the mature and responsible designing of things that gives architects and architecture its value. I think that good architecture and good design too often becomes invisible. So, when a building is designed really well and you walk in, you might gasp the first time or the second time or the third time, but after a while, it's just the place you go to work. And I think this is maybe another dimension where we could do a better job, I think, of letting people know that these are the benefits that this particular design brings. Like, this is the role that architects are actually playing in your daily life. Not sure entirely how we do that, but I think, when I'm advocating for the value of design, I point to things like disasters, towards sustainability, towards all these different things, and say, like, somebody has to make these choices. Who do you want making them? Architects or someone else?
I can't remember the exact percentage, but the overwhelming majority of buildings in the United States are created without the direct involvement of an architect. How can we convince the public of the need for architects and the value proposition of architecture?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's on us. I mean, I think it's unfortunate that we point the finger at the public for not knowing more about what we do or what its value is, you know? I mean, I think that medicine and law do a very good job of curating their public perception, mostly through TV and this sort of thing. But, you know, what do we really do to manage the sort of public image of what architects are? The public image that most public people would be familiar with is the star architect thing, right? So you get a public association of the architect as someone who just designs big, shiny things for rich people. And then you wonder why people don't really feel it's important to have, you know, an architect involved in their work and their lives, because we told them that that's not what we do. So, you know, I'd love to see the AIA or REBA or somebody embark on a decade-long or 2-decade-long project and say, like, how do we actually, like, shape people's ideas about what architecture is and, you know, what value it can bring. You know, if you look at the REBA guidance or the AI guidance today about what value an architect can bring, you know, there's, I think on each website, there's 4 or 5 bullet points, which frankly are just not convincing at all. You know, I mean, there are things like, well, you know, using an architect can save you money. So can not using an architect, you know, like it's not like a persuasive argument. So, you know, it's the sort of thing where, you know, we have to realize that our value extends partially from that perception, and it's worth cultivating, you know, it's worth fighting for. And I think there's a lot of architects out there that just have given up and kind of look on, okay, well, the general public doesn't know what we do or appreciate what we do. So let's just focus on our clients. They get us and they're willing to write checks. So that's going to be our constituency. Architecture is fundamentally a public art. So, I mean, I would say that everybody's our constituency.
Yes, but it seems to be invisible to many. I want to sort of switch a little bit to an article that you wrote for us recently called "In the Future, Everyone's an Architect and Why That's a Good Thing." Tell us a bit about what you were trying to convey with that provocative title.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I was advocating for a particular position as much as I was advocating for a greater awareness about an emergent technology and the implications that I was going to have. One of the conclusions of that article is that the rapid advance of AI and the penetration into design fields is going to democratize design. It's historically always been the path of technology to turn the user of a technology into an operator, right? So telephones and elevators were technology that at one point you needed a dedicated, trained, licensed operator, but you know, the technology proceeds far enough and fast enough that there's no elevator operators anymore. Like we just push a button. And I think at the time, and today still, there's a lot of excitement about natural language, generative AI, and generative design. And that struck me as a very, very spooky thing because, you know, once design programs can operate off of natural language, there's nothing to suggest that architects are going to be the ones in charge of them, right? You're essentially, one of the kind of age-old roles of the architect was to be an interlocutor between the client's wishes and desires and whatever the vision was, you know, the eventual built project. And architects are damn near psychic sometimes. And when the client comes around and has a bunch of ideas that are incoherent or mixed up about, you know, oh, I want this and that. But that's what's great about architects is they're able to take that rambling and put it together as a design that actually satisfies that client's inarticulate intent. But you take that out and you put in place a machine that can actually translate that sort of thing as well. I think you've got a problem. So I think that in the future, you know, will everybody be an architect? Yeah, maybe to some degree it's a provocation. I do think that these emerging technologies are going to go a long way to putting that kind of power in the hands of people who ordinarily wouldn't have it.
So when you think about these technologies and you think about all the work that you've done in resilience and in disaster recovery, Are there ways in which these technologies can be leveraged to help create a much more resilient built environment, maybe even one that's more secure than we can imagine now?
Yeah, absolutely. We spoke earlier about resource constraints in the global south, things like that. I think the world needs about 10 times more architects than it currently has. I mean, there's just a lot of problems out there. And architects in the West, in Europe, and to some degree Asia and the United States, we're gainfully employed for now. We have a lot of things to do, but there's billions, literally billions of people out there that need architects and don't have them. So I think that there is, yes, an enormous opportunity for these kinds of technologies to fulfill that mission and to serve as a design partner to the design professions themselves and extend their reach. What is it, 97, 98% of buildings in the United States are done, without an architect. And we can go back and forth about whether or not that's because people don't see the value in it. But I think fundamentally, a lot of people can't afford it. And the economics don't make sense if you're doing a $500,000 house to commission an architect to do a design or get involved at any level. If you're at a 100-person firm, there's no way to kind of get involved at projects that kind of small scale. But you bring generative design and AI into the picture, maybe those economics change quite a bit. So I think there's a huge opportunity to leverage this technology and bring that sort of expertise into areas of the world that desperately need it and areas of the world that, have historically not been interested because fundamentally the economics don't work.
Well, I've just got one more question for you. When you think about the future from your perspective, are you more optimistic or pessimistic, and why?
Oh, I'm hugely optimistic.
Okay.
Everybody gets that wrong about me. They think because I'm always musing about disaster and these things that I must be kind of a downer. And maybe sometimes I am, I don't know. But I'm fundamentally a very optimistic person because humans are always at their best when things get to their worst. And Churchill has this saying about the Americans where they will always do the right thing after they've exhausted every other option. And it's one of my favorites. I think it applies to everybody, not just Americans. It's kind of a fundamental human trait to behave like that. And, since I retired from field work after the Nepal work in 2015 and turned to teaching, and that's given me a very different perspective because I've been able to kind of look through all of the history of disaster. And, it's just profound the way that human beings react to crisis and disaster. Going back to Nile River Delta civilizations, harnessing floods to create agriculture. I think every advance in technology has enabled us to move on to higher and better things, higher value things, more productive things, more rewarding things. And I think the AI thing is not going to be any different. We have to make some choices about what we're going to do after this, because I think AI is going to bring so many productivity gains that it's going to be very disruptive in the short term, a little mini disaster, if you will. But our reaction, and by our, I mean humans' reaction to disaster is almost always productive. We almost always end up creating something that is bigger and grander and more aspirational than the thing that we were doing before. And like the Galveston example, nobody moved to fix the toilets in that city until the hurricane happened. And sometimes disaster is the only thing that can actually shake people out of their stupor and lead to the sort of changes that everybody kind of agrees are already necessary. I foresee something similar with architecture. You put 100 architects together, they're all going to have basically the same criticisms of the profession. And yet the problems have been stubborn. We haven't been able to fix them as of yet. Maybe AI is that triggering event. It's that hurricane, it's that earthquake that levels the city, and then we all get together and we say, okay, well, we don't want that to happen again. How do we fix this whole problem of super long licensure periods and low salaries and precarious employments and all of those things? That's my hope, that this is a moment that, we can kind of look at the issues that we all know are problems and start to fix them.
Well, it's a great way to look at the future, to move forward into uncertain territory with a faith in how we can address and maybe even come back stronger from otherwise negative events. Well, Eric, I really appreciate you taking some time with us, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface of this conversation, but look forward to continuing it in the future.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of This is Design Intelligence. The producer is Laura Spells. The sound engineer is Jared Knable. This has been a DI Media Group production.